Good evening, and welcome to the final Berges lecture series for the fall, speaker for the fall 2012 academic semester. Our presenter have his information here, but tell you a little bit more about Kristopher Kris, Exelon Vice President, Deputy General Counsel for Compliance and Ethics, and he's had this position since March of 2012. He's held a number of other positions at Exelon, but he's responsible for governance and oversight of the company's compliance program and their standards of conduct, privacy, which is a big issue, and a number of other things. He worked previously at other positions at Exelon, most recently before Compliance and Ethics, Director of Equal Opportunity Case Management and Employee Dispute Resolution, which sounds like it was good training for the ethics officer, Kris. Kris is involved as a founding member of the Boys and Girls Club of Naperville, Illinois, where he lives. He also represents Exelon as a member of DePaul University's Institute for Business and Professional Ethics, and a mutual friend recommended Kris highly to me. Kris earned a bachelor's degree from Princeton University, and he has his law degree, cum laude, from Temple University. So please join me, and this is his first trip ever to Notre Dame, so please join me in a warm Notre Dame welcome to Kristopher Kris.
All right, let's see if this is working. Can you hear me now? Good. Thank you, Professor Murphy, for that very kind introduction. It is definitely an honor and a privilege to participate in the Berges lecture series, particularly given the impressive list of speakers that you've had before. I do appreciate being here during the rather impressive run that this school is currently on. I'm trying to remember, what school is on the menu this weekend? Wake Forest. There you go. There you go. I think there's a graduate of Wake Forest who might be in the audience, so sorry, had to take that shot. But I'd like to also thank Patricia Werheim in absentia. She is the Wicklander Chair of Business Ethics at DePaul University, and she was kind enough to recommend that I join you in today's event. Now, that said, if I don't live up to the standards set by the other speakers who addressed this forum in the past, well, you get what you pay for. Now, before I begin my remarks, and I really don't view this as a lecture, but instead a discussion on ethics in the utility sector, I do have three very quick disclaimers. First, and I will sound like a member of a federal agency here, I admit, anything I say today represent my own personal opinions and in no way reflect the positions or policies of Exelon Corporation whatsoever. So I definitely had to get that out there. Second, I am the son of a Baptist minister, which means I am genetically predisposed to perspire. If you see the trusty handkerchief come out to dab the brow, I promise I won't faint. I promise. But third, I would encourage questions and interruptions at any time. I think we will all learn more if we can have a dialogue. And I will leave time at the end for questions, but as much of a dialogue as possible as opposed to you in the audience listening to me drone on for a period of time. So let's talk about electricity. And let's imagine a world without electricity, as the TV series Revolution posits. We ignite fossil fuels to boil water and create steam, to spin turbines and move electrons on the transmission superhighway. We harness the power of rivers and dams to, again, move turbines, get them in motion to produce electricity and get them on the grid. We leverage the science of nuclear fission and the energy and heat produced in that process to create steam that, again, moves turbines and moves electrons. We construct solar ranches and wind farms in a quest to lessen our impact on the environment. Regardless of the method used to generate electricity, however, the electric utility industry has not been immune to ethical dilemmas. Now, any discussion, let's see if this works, regarding ethical issues in the utility industry has to begin with a true plutocrat of his day, Samuel Insel. Now, Sam Insel was born in England of very modest means. His father was a lay preacher in the Congregational Church, and his mom was a housewife. They crusaded for several years for numerous causes, including expanded suffrage in England, and also temperance, or the denouncement of alcoholism. Go figure. They managed to send 2 of their 5 children to Oxford for 8 years, and Sam was one who attended Oxford. He proved to be a very astute student and a very diligent office clerk and stenographer for an auctioneer as a teenager, until he was fired for nepotism. I think the owner's nephew needed a job, so poor Sam had to go. But that disappointment and humiliation led to a role that would truly change his life and indeed shape an entire industry. According to author Forrest McDonald, Sam Insel responded to a job ad for the London desk of the Mercantile Trust Company of New York. In doing so, he unknowingly joined the European representative of Thomas Edison. Now, his role as a stenographer, of all things, exposed him to everything from corporate finance to engineering and technical design as Edison competed to build telephone networks in London. Ultimately, Sam Insel traveled to America in 1881 to become Thomas Edison's personal secretary. But after proving to be very, very adept and immensely loyal, he rose to become the corporate secretary of many of Thomas Edison's business ventures. So the next 12 to 5 years were nothing short of remarkable for this burgeoning electric utility industry in the United States. During this time, the Edison Electric Illuminating Company and its manufacturing affiliates in New York seized upon 2 technical developments that really dramatized electricity. First was the electric streetcar system, and next was a practical solution allowing alternating current to be used for lighting. Previously, direct current was the only source of electricity. Now, Edison and Insel had to prove the concept of building central generating stations that served a geographic area. And branches of the growing streetcar network bore this out. Now, by contrast, the industrialists of the time were concerned about reliability. They were accustomed to having isolated plants physically located adjacent to their factories that served only their factories. And I think it's similar to the discussion that a lot of businesses and debates a lot of businesses are having today about leveraging cloud computing. So if you think about it, companies are familiar with owning their own servers and having their own servers on their premises and simply consider it too unpredictable to allow Amazon or Google or Microsoft to control something so central to their business operations. But I digress. Residents of that era, on the other hand, continued to use gas lamps for lighting and viewed electricity as something reserved for the privileged few. In fact, when Edison Electric opened its Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan in 1882, it produced power for all of 800 electric light bulbs. Likewise, when Sam Insel eventually moved to Chicago in 1892 to run the Chicago Edison Company, and he had J.P. Morgan, ironically, to thank for that. There was some interesting maneuvering that Mr. Morgan, the J.P. Morgan, did with the Edison Electric Board that resulted in Sam Insel leaving. Chicago had less than 5,000 residents of its 1 million who used electric lights. Insel intended to serve the million. But in order to do so, he had to contend with an insidious ethical issue, what author Forrest McDonald called the ethics of political graft in Chicago. As streetcars became more important to urban life, certain politicians seized upon the opportunity to attach the quote-unquote public interest label to key industries. This fostered extortion, pure and simple, from entrepreneurs who were threatened with costly legislation. These unscrupulous politicians knew that the people viewed gas and electric utilities as their natural enemies. And today, when you think about it, people believe that electricity should be free, right? Why should we have to pay for something so basic as electricity? So the politicians used franchise laws as a tremendously effective hammer. Insel was able to outsmart a rather cunning group of politicians, and which ultimately resulted in the purchase of the Commonwealth Electric Company, Chicago Edison Company, Commonwealth Electric Company, which was a shell utility created by the politicians to try to oust him. In the process, though, he gained a 50-year franchise in the city of Chicago. Thus began the steps toward the first state-sanctioned electric monopoly. But I think the first ethical challenge faced by the utility industry, though, was understanding and navigating the politics of power. Now, the next 3 to 5 decades saw an even greater transformation for the electric utility industry. One key factor was the rapid growth of the number of municipally owned electric plants. This segment of the generation output tripled in a decade from roughly 400 in 1896 to more than 1,250 in 1906. But largely out of self-preservation, Insel forged an industry coalition, the National Electric Light Association, or NELA, the forerunner of the current Edison Electric Institute, or EEI, that successfully argued against this development. NELA proposed that electric companies be regulated by state agencies that would establish rates and also set service standards. The consortium realized the need for a regulatory construct that would make providing electric service to the masses a reality. And so by 1907, Wisconsin became the first state to create an independent state regulatory agency, a utility commission. And it was quickly joined by New York and Massachusetts. By 1916, 33 states had regulatory agencies in place. But I think in this particular instance, in the evolution of the industry, the politics of power truly had the public interest in mind. So the focus at this time was removing the element of local political graft from the equation, and instead establishing independent commissions of experts to ensure that the most efficient means of supplying the public need for electricity stayed healthy. A formula of cost plus rate making evolved. A concept of rate stratification emerged. And if you think about it logically, it makes sense. It recognizes that a factory should not be charged the same amount per unit of consumption or kilowatt hour as a residential customer. And it took the utility commissions to recognize this as a reality. Natural monopolies were sanctioned so that integrated utilities could generate, transmit, and ultimately deliver electricity to customers efficiently. Now, as the economy boomed through the 1920s, so did the fortunes of utility magnates, like Sam Insel. but there was a dark side. What the nascent utility commissions didn't realize was that Insel and his peers created complex utility holding companies that encumbered the regulated utilities with bond offerings and many other types of debt of their unregulated affiliates. So this meant that several holding companies, no more than a dozen in the United States, owned the regulated approximately 70 to 75% of the regulated utilities across the country. But these holding companies, unfortunately, took the ethical turn of manipulating and artificially increasing the cost basis of the electric utilities. So for example, if a utility company, as many did, owned a streetcar network as part of its unregulated affiliates, it would artificially charge the streetcar network an increased amount for electric service. And that increased amount, through the cost-plus rate-making process, was baked into the utility rates for all of the regulated utilities' customers. The Great Depression brought this reality into very sharp focus because utility holding companies, the parent companies, were unable to pay their obligations. Not surprisingly, in retrospect, when one subsidiary fell, the other dominoes in the utility holding company structure soon followed. Now, Insel's empire absolutely imploded in the early 1930s. He symbolized for many the excesses of the Roaring '20s and was ultimately indicted and tried, though acquitted, of fraud and several other charges. Now, Congress reacted by passing the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, or PUCO, as it's affectionately known in the utility industry. In essence, PUCO was designed to do three things. First, facilitate the regulation of utilities by either limiting their operations to a single state or forcing them to divest interests so that each utility became a single integrated entity within a limited geographic area. Second, PUCO prevented utility holding companies from engaging in these non-regulated business operations unless the company sought SEC approval. And third, the law vested in the Federal Power Commission, which is now FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the authority to ensure that affiliates no longer sold goods or services to each other, primarily to the regulated utilities, for a profit. And ultimately, it worked. By 1948, the number of integrated utilities controlled by holding companies was reduced by 85%, from almost 2,000 to a low of 303 by 1948. But it was because of the ethical failures, indeed the duplicity and deception of high-profile executives, that the industry once again had to submit to the politics of power. Despite these new rules, PUCO rules, and all of the regulations that implemented the law, the utility industry enjoyed almost uninterrupted prosperity in the mid-20th century. During this post-war era, a demand for electricity grew extremely rapidly. Tremendous capital investments were made to construct new generation facilities, primarily coal, and natural gas, and oil-fired plants, which again were baked into the rate-making process. In addition, during this window of time, Congress passed the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, which allowed the private development of commercial nuclear power. Congress took the additional step in 1954 of passing a law that reduced the private liability of these companies that constructed commercial nuclear plants by guaranteeing public compensation in the event of a commercial nuclear catastrophe. But this run was tempered by the economic stagnation of the 1970s and ultimately the recession of the 1980s. High inflation impacted electric utilities whose ambitious capital programs were heavily financed by borrowing. Also, the OPEC embargo caused a sharp rise in all fossil fuel prices. The data reported by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, or EIA, are absolutely staggering. So during this window of time, petroleum costs more than doubled in 1974 alone. It increased an average of 25%, 26% per year for that decade. Likewise, natural gas prices rose over 23% each year for this decade. And then coal prices increased an average of almost 16% per year during the decade. So the pressures of higher inflation and labor and material and financing costs caused a fourfold increase in the cost to build commercial nuclear power plants. And if you think about it, there were requests to build approximately 130 nuclear power plants in the early 70s. I don't think the United States has had one built for a period of 20 to 25 years because of these heavy, heavy cost overruns. But these operating cost increases and overruns were ultimately passed on to customers through, again, the cost plus rate-making process. Simultaneously, Congress responded to the energy crisis and growing environmental concerns by passing numerous laws that affected the industry as well. They include, the Clean Air Act of 1970, which required utilities to reduce pollution emissions, particularly SO2. The Clean Water Act of 1972, which limited utility waste discharges into our streams and rivers. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which directed standards for disposal of both hazardous and non-hazardous material utility waste. And then the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, gotta love these acronyms like PUCO, which was meant to promote a greater use of domestic renewable energy sources by essentially forcing the natural monopolies to buy power from more efficient producers. So what we saw in this era, in the mid-2000s, was a shift in the politics of power. Policymakers made clear that the public interest necessarily included environmental considerations. That debate, of course, lingers on today. Also, consecutive administrations signaled the desire to deregulate the marketplace. So in the early 1990s, Congress faced intense lobbying pressure to pass legislation that would open electricity, sales to marketers. Deregulation, which allowed customers to negotiate the best possible terms for the supply and transportation charges, had nearly a decade of success at this point with the natural gas industry. Bless you. So policymakers agreed and passed the Energy Policy Act of 1992. FERC, following its mandate to implement regulations that make the laws, help the laws come into being and implement the regulations, issued a series of orders that first deregulated natural gas and subsequently deregulated the electric utility industry. So the orders provided open access to transmission, again, the superhighways, of getting the commodity from supplier to load services. Restructuring the sales process, allowing customers full and open access to the markets. And by 1996 and 1999, orders were issued that fundamentally changed the industry. No longer were utilities able to charge more to suppliers to move their electricity on their transmission lines. We now had to have open access to transmission. Bless you. Likewise, all utilities had to participate in an open access same-time information system, or OASIS, that informed the entire industry of the capacity that one had on its transmission systems. And finally, an order instructed the creation and fostered participation in what's called regional transmission organizations, taking the actual movement of electricity out of the hands of individual utilities and placing that responsibility in independent system operators. Within a decade, electrons had become a commodity with a marketplace. Now, lurking in the weeds, however, was an energy trading operator whose self-professed integrity was truly, truly unparalleled. That is, until the California energy crisis of 2000, which was dominated by sporadic blackouts across California and soaring electricity prices, exposed this trading operator for the market manipulator it truly, truly was. A trader had the audacity to name a strategy to game the California market Death Star in an internal email. But there were individuals in this organization who did operate with integrity, who did confront the CEO about off-the-book partnerships, joint ventures, and other entities his lieutenants used to enrich themselves while concealing corporate losses. Now, although much has been written about Enron, one thing is quite clear. The power of politics shifted once more. But surprisingly, the reaction from policymakers was not retrenchment, but instead reinforcement of its commitment, their commitment, to the open marketplace. But this time there would be more controls. There would absolutely be additional oversight to ensure that those who are in the market play by the rules. And the Energy Policy Act of 2005 endowed regulators with far more authority, including the ability to levy substantial penalties to protect the integrity of open, transparent markets. So here we stand beyond 2010, facing significant policy decisions. And they truly, truly create ethical dilemmas. The politics of power are not inherently evil or unethical. I think the examples that I shared are the outliers. I certainly hope they are. But as I reflected on the utility industry in preparing for this discussion, it really became readily apparent that politics and power are inextricably linked. In a capitalist society, one needs to have basic infrastructure to grow and operate businesses. And utility companies, even though we think electricity should be free, truly power people's lives. But this infrastructure is in the public interest in its truest form. However, energy does not have to be a zero-sum game, in my opinion. From my own personal perspective, protecting the markets needs to be the paramount goal and objective among all policymakers. I think markets that are distorted when tax incentives are offered to certain niche industries beyond their point of maturity, or the concept of subsidized generation using taxpayer funds to build a clean coal facility in Illinois or a gas-fired station in New Jersey, and ultimately mandating that the local regulated utilities buy the output at above market prices is misguided. Oftentimes, the appeal of a jobs bill or a job creation is the concept used to sell the ideas, but truly misguided nonetheless. The ethical dilemmas for policymakers as we continue on the quest for energy independence becomes a question of how. How do we go about establishing that independence when we need to do so in a sustainable way? How do we go about encouraging an industry to truly embody sustainability in its environmental, social, and economic considerations? So what I think we need is a comprehensive policy that encourages generation development and other developments in a manner that reinforces the sustainability concept. And what I hope to gain from, or what I hope to see from policymakers at a minimum, is an open debate about all of the opportunities we have to generate this much needed resource in a way that we can do so sustainably. I will end my remarks there and open the floor for questions. Early.
While they're thinking, I'll ask you one.
Sure.
In your current role on the compliance ethics officer, what are the most challenging, issues that come up?
The most challenging issues that come up as an ethics and compliance officer. I think it's the unknown. So our team has the responsibility to be concerned about the behaviors of 26,000 employees. And at any time, we can have an issue from the C-suite, we can have an issue from a rank and file employee that impacts our core values and our code of business conduct. So I think what we've done to arrest anything from happening that'll negatively impact the company's reputation is ensure that the message of the core values to be in the organization are reinforced by managers at all levels. So we do quite a bit of outreach with executives, directors, managers, supervisors to ensure that they know that they need to live the values themselves in order for their teams to mirror that responsibility. Yes? Do I see an ethical issue with nuclear power? No. No, I think nuclear power has its place in the energy independence that we hear from policymakers as the ultimate objective. I think that we've done ourselves a disservice by not tackling the question of spent nuclear fuel, what we do with the uranium after it's produced energy. And that's one question that really will need support at the local, state, federal level in order to get solved. But I do think that nuclear power is a necessary component of our energy stack, to use the phrase. Yes? What do I think is the best way to get energy independence? Sure. From my own personal perspective, everything should be on the table. That means when we hear about the prospect of leveraging fracking to release oil in the United States, we should explore it. Now, that said, I also think we should know what the chemical cocktail actually is that's going into the ground, which hasn't truly been disclosed yet. But I do think all options should be on the table, for sure. Yes? Sure. The question is, do we work with smart grids at Exelon? The answer is absolutely. So we have 3 regulated utilities that serve primarily Chicago, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, and each one is engaged in smart grid rollout. It is a very expensive proposition. Our Philadelphia affiliate will probably spend $600 million. Our Chicago affiliate will probably spend $1.3 billion over the next 5 to 10 years. But I foresee smart grid transforming the industry yet again. And in a real world application, it will allow utilities to be far more responsive when our power goes out, believe it or not. It'll allow us to automate a lot of the processes that have to happen manually now. But also, it'll give each of us as consumers a lot more independence in the ability to control and manage our consumption, which in turn manages how much we spend on the service we think should be free anyway. But I think it will show tremendous benefits in the future. Sure. Yes?
How in a business setting do you reconcile the environmental costs versus the monetary costs of producing energy?
So the question is, how do we reconcile the environmental cost with the economic cost of environmentalism, essentially, in the production of energy? It's funny, I was talking to Professor Murphy about this earlier. Our previous CEO was truly a visionary in this regard, and he drove the company to develop what we call our Exelon 2020 strategy. And it really has 3 components. One is delivering, really becoming the greenest, cleanest electricity generator in the industry. The other is educating consumers and our customers so they can become more energy efficient. And the third component is walking the talk, is really ensuring that our own operations are as efficient as possible. And so we reconcile it by, from a generating the electricity perspective, having a very diverse portfolio. We have each of these components in our fleet of generation facilities. Not much coal, but certainly natural gas-fired plants, certainly nuclear plants, and both, well, not both, but the trifecta of wind, solar, and hydroelectric power. So we've done our best to diversify how we generate electricity to live up to that value. Yes?
Do you think that there should be government incentives in order to prompt energy companies to use more alternative energy?
Should there be government incentives to prompt utilities to use more alternative energies? We are locked in that debate right now with the production tax credit for wind farms. I think the answer is yes. I think there should be incentives. That's what, ironically, taxes are for in a lot of ways. They are to incent certain behaviors. So that's one lever that policymakers can pull to make that happen. What I'm less convinced about is knowing when to say when, knowing when to end the tax credits. And so that's the debate that we're struggling with right now. After a while, they take a life of their own, and they become perpetual. But we need to figure out when is the right time to end them. Yes?
Seems like all power plants use water, heat the water, spin the turbine. Are there any people looking into different fuels or liquids that can be used that have a lower capacity?
Right, right. Great question. The question is, there's an awful lot of water consumed in the electricity generation process, which is absolutely true. I am not aware of any other liquids that are being considered for that process, but that's an interesting item for some engineers or other scientists to help us figure out. Other questions? Yes.
Can I just a follow-up question?
Sure.
How can you determine when they're at maturity levels? Because a lot of President Obama's support for alternative energies and college questions, carefully picking winners and losers. How do you sort of balance like the free market with wanting to promote certain types of energy?
Sure. So how do you balance the free market versus other types of energy when the incentives can be construed as picking winners and losers? I'm not an economist, and I would rely on economists to help us understand the impact of removing the incentives and what that might do to a reduction in production of or creation of wind farms, for example. But looking at the economics alone, it costs far more to build the renewable generation sources than the traditional gas-fired plant, for example. And again, it's the ethical dilemma that the policymakers have to struggle with now to help us get past that. So, knowing when to say when rather. My own Exelon Corporation owns quite a few wind farms across the country. And we think that, so this is one time I want to step into a corporate role and toe the company line. We think that it's time to end the tax credit. We are not very well liked right now among other wind generators, but that's okay. Yes?
So going back to the natural gas question from earlier, if Exelon is basically supporting natural gas industry, do you think there's an ethical issue not knowing what exactly the chemical cocktail is? How does Exelon
Oh,
that they don't know that we if they're helping to support the industry?
but we're helping to support the industry. I'm sorry, I didn't.
So you're a utility of the natural gas industry. So would you say essentially you're helping to support the production of natural gas?
Oh.
Then you aren't sure what's going into the ground, so I'm just wondering if you guys see ethical issues there.
Sure. I think I understand the question. So we don't produce natural gas. So we're not one of the companies in Pennsylvania right now, fracking the shale to extract it. But we certainly do use it as one of our fuel sources to fire the generation facilities. Ironically, natural gas is far less harmful once burned on the environment than coal. So from the environmental perspective, we view that as a cleaner source of energy. From a consumer perspective, this is, again, just me talking personally, I have a personal problem with not knowing what's in that cocktail. So I think the company, and I think Exelon, the corporation would encourage the disclosure of that information, fundamentally. Yes?
What is your opinion on the 2010 San Bruno pipeline explosion and Pacific gas?
Tragic. Preventable.
Can you explain exactly what happened?
Sure. The San Bruno, I think it was, a gas explosion occurred in a suburb, I think southeast of San Francisco, but somewhere around the San Francisco metropolitan area. And a gas main, let's assume it's about 36 inches in diameter, probably vintage 1950s or something, in cast iron, ruptured and caused a massive explosion and fire that killed dozens of people, wiped out neighborhoods. It was truly a disaster. It was just horrible to watch. What we know now is that the utility didn't follow its own maintenance programs. The utility kept lackluster records to track what was done and when these mains were inspected. So that has served as a lesson to the entire industry on the preventative maintenance that we need to engage in to make sure that that does not happen again. Two of our subsidiaries do deliver natural gas to consumers, and they have absolutely beefed up their inspection and maintenance programs, for sure. So my own opinion is that it was preventable, that it was absolutely tragic that, that something like that happened. Yes, sir.
I know that wind power and solar energy are kind of stable source of power currently. I think it's generally nuclear power or gas power. Is Exelon investigating ways of storing that energy to make it more sustainable for them?
If anyone can develop ways to store energy, you will be famously rich, for sure. That is, you're right. You're absolutely right. So the question is, have we invested in ways to store energy? We haven't yet, but we're watching it very closely. I think, we have a team that we call our strategy office, and they scour the globe for different investment opportunities. And we recognize that that is the greatest limitation to solar power, wind power. There's still load. People still use electricity at night. And when it's 95 and 95% humidity in June in Chicago, the wind's not blowing. So we have to figure out ways to store the capacity from those renewable sources in order to use them and tap into them when the load requires it. So we are definitely following the storage issue very closely. That's going to be the next game changer for the utility industry, definitely. Hopefully someone in the room will have the business plan to bring it to fruition. Yes, sir.
As an energy company,
Yeah.
Exelon gets paid for selling energy. And earlier we had discussed its efforts towards getting consumers to conserve more.
Right.
So how do you reconcile that tension between selling more energy and asking people to consume less?
Sure. How do we reconcile the tension between selling more and asking consumers to consume less? That's a great question, but it's one that that Exelon 2020 roadmap clearly identifies as something that we need to do. I think the reconciliation comes about with the environmental impact of reducing consumption. So I think fundamentally, viewed holistically, if we as an organization are delivering greener sources of electric generation and the need normalizes, then I think we're in a much better space to portray ourselves, at least, to who we are, or live up to the core value that we have of protecting the environment. And that said, we've taken many steps to live that ultimately. We've added hundreds of electric vehicles, natural gas powered vehicles, or biofuel vehicles to our fleets. We've gone through and by location and retrofitted lighting and other sources of consumption to reduce our own energy intake. But you're right, it's an interesting dynamic when you compare and balance the two, definitely.
Kris, why don't you maybe end with a few
Sure.
words of advice for students going into the corporate world? Some things you've learned over the years that you could help our students maybe work through on their own?
So a few words of advice as you enter the corporate world. The word fit leaps to mind. And you'd be amazed at how many people join a company not understanding what the culture is like, what the values are like, what the ethical tolerance is like. And if your own core values are mismatched with a company's core values, it will be a miserable 8, 10, 12 hours a day. But my recommendation would be, as you are going into the business world, interview the company. It's not just the company interviewing you, but interview the company to ensure that you find that fit with your own core values. That is a tremendous miss for a lot of people, I think. And when they are in an organization that doesn't mesh with their values, then issues and tension arise. Okay, thank you. Appreciate you.
Join me in a warm round of applause.
Thank you.